Preparing for this event this week, I Googled "climate which way out," which is basically the title of the event, and I was trying to find the event's own homepage. Instead, here is the actual first page of Google results that I got for "climate which way out." We can't just geoengineer our way out of climate change. commondreams.org. Ocean algae can evolve fast to tackle climate change, Scientific American. Ultimately, we have to invent our way out, an article in the New Yorker. Liquid metal battery, can we invent our way out of climate change? Nationaljournal.com, can we regulate our way out of climate change? And grist.org, can we 3D print our way out of climate change? I kid you not. So maybe I'll ask our panelists later how many of those statements they think are true. I did not go on to Google page 2. Let me introduce all our speakers tonight, beginning with Bill McKibben, author and environmentalist, founder of 350.org, the first planet-wide grassroots climate change movement. And since this is kind of his show this weekend, you all know who he is, and I couldn't even get through the rest of the bio with the Gandhi Prize and the Thomas Merton Prize, and the Boston Globe called him probably America's most important environmentalist. One more time, Bill McKibben. Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist, syndicated columnist, and the author of the international bestsellers The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, and No Logo. Naomi writes a regular column for The Nation and The Guardian and is a contributing editor at Harper's, and she is on the board of directors of Bills350.org. Her new book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, was published just this month. Hold it up. By Simon & Schuster, and Naomi will be signing books at the end of the event. Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who worked for 15 years. As a foreign correspondent for the New York Times. He is the author of 14 books, including his latest New York Times bestseller, which he co-wrote with the graphic artist Joe Sacco, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt. He writes a weekly column for the online magazine Truth Dig, and Chris will be signing books at the end of the event as well. And Kshama Sawant. Kshama. I guess the buses mostly came from Seattle. Kshama Sawant was elected to Seattle City Council as a socialist alternative candidate last November with more than 93,000 votes. And for those of you who are from Brooklyn who may not know her already, she defeated a 16-year incumbent Democrat to become the first socialist elected in a major U.S. city in decades. She accepts only the average worker's wage and donates the rest of her six-figure salary to building social justice movements. Kshama ran as a Since being elected, Kshama spearheaded the effort to mobilize a movement for a $15 an hour minimum wage, which was won in Seattle this past spring. And now let me introduce our first and keynote speaker, Senator Bernie Sanders. I'm supposed to do the bio, so let me get through it here. He was elected to the U.S. Senate in 2006 after serving 16 years in the House of Representatives. He is the longest-serving independent member of Congress in American history. Born in 1941 in Brooklyn. Bernie was the younger of two sons in a modest-income family. After graduation from the University of Chicago in 1964, he moved to Vermont. He has focused on the shrinking middle class and widening income gap in America, reversing global warming, universal health care, fair trade policies, supporting veterans, and preserving family farms. He serves on 5 Senate committees: Budget, Veterans, Energy, Environment, and Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, which incredibly is one committee. He chairs the Veterans Affairs Committee. Please welcome Senator Bernie Sanders.
Thank you. Thank you. But before I begin, let me make a couple of confessions. First, I am the reason the meeting started late. Plane was late. These guys were very nice and they waited. Second of all, we're going to move this cushion chair over here. That looks a little bit too royal for me, so we'll join the masses over here. And let me also express my honor and pleasure to be here with such great panelists. I think all of you know that Bill McKibben is a neighbor of mine. He's 40 miles down the road in Ripton, Vermont. And we're very, I've read Naomi's books, and she is clearly one of the great authors on the planet. And Kshama has done an unbelievable job in Seattle. And we're all proud of the writings of Chris. So I am very honored to be here with such a distinguished panel. Let me just start it off by telling you what you already know. First, you all know what Fox TV does not know, and that is that climate change is real, and that about 97% of all peer-reviewed writers who write for scientific journals understand that. They understand that governments throughout the world recognize the reality and the dangers of global warming. The debate is over as to what has caused global warming. It is caused by human activities and carbon emissions. The debate is over about the impact of global warming. Every night we hear more about floods and droughts and forest fires and heat waves and rising sea levels and extreme weather conditions. This is what is occurring now, today, in the United States and all over the world, and what the scientists tell us, most significantly, if we do not get our act together, if we do not reverse global warming, that situation will become worse and worse and worse. The timeline is short. We have got to act now. Interestingly enough, the debate is over in some unlikely areas. If you ask the Department of Defense, if you ask the CIA, what they consider to be one of the great national security issues facing this planet, they will tell you that it is global warming. They will tell you that they fear very much. They will tell you that they fear very much what happens when you have desperate people who are fighting for arable land. And they will tell you what will happen when there is not enough water and when you see mass migrations of people. So on top of all of the other concerns, there is a real understanding that unless we address the crisis of global warming, this planet will be even more insecure, more unstable than it is today. And the debate is also over. You know, I know sometimes people say, well, if you're going to be aggressive and address climate change, global warming, it's going to cost a lot of money. Well, yeah, it is. But if we don't address it, it's going to cost a hell of a lot more. Those of you in New York City and New Jersey understand what Hurricane Sandy did to this area. Cost the taxpayers of this country $60 billion. Bill and I are from Vermont. We had Hurricane Irene, almost $1 billion to address that issue. And there is no doubt that if we do not get our act together, we will be expending huge sums of money trying to rebuild from the destruction of global warming. Now, given the fact that I think most people in America and around the world and governments around the world understand the crisis, the planetary crisis facing us, the obvious question is what should the United States be doing and what should other countries around the world be doing? And I think the answer is pretty simple. We have got to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel, move to energy efficiency and sustainable energy. Now, the truth is that we can, in fact, I know people get very depressed, reasonably so, about the political scene here. But the truth of the matter is, in my view, and I'm quite sure that I'm right, that if we had the political will as a nation, if we were prepared to stand up to the Koch brothers, to the big oil companies, to the coal companies, and transform our energy system, I believe that in a reasonably short period of time, we can do that. Just to give you some examples, just modest examples. We managed to get some money into Vermont to weatherize people's homes, get them off oil. With modest investments, we were able to cut people's consumption of oil by 30%. If we did that all over America, we would make significant reductions in carbon emissions. We would save people money on their fuel bills, and we could create hundreds of thousands of jobs. We have the capability now to transform our transportation system, to end the embarrassment of the United States lagging far behind Europe, Japan, even China in terms of rail. Let's invest in rail, not in roads. We have made some progress in the electrification of vehicles and in hybrids. We should and can do a lot better than that. We can have cars getting 100 miles per gallon. We can have electric cars all over this country, and we can have hybrids if we made those investments. Furthermore, we are sitting now on the enormous potential of transforming our energy system in the sense of solar. I have introduced legislation for 10 million solar rooftops. We are seeing now in California and elsewhere huge solar plants being built and being put into use, which are providing electricity for hundreds of thousands of homes. We are seeing states, I was in Iowa recently, they have a lot of wind in Iowa. We should multiply, significantly increase the amount of wind that we are using in this country. Geothermal has tremendous potential. Used properly, biomass has potential. We're making breakthroughs in terms of lighting. with LEDs. We're making breakthroughs in terms of getting much more cost-effective, energy-efficient appliances as well. All of this and more is sitting out there if we invest in research and development. It is not utopian thinking to say that we can transform our energy system, that we could get rid of fossil fuel, that the United States could lead the world in helping other countries move in that direction. That's not utopian thinking. That is reality. That's what could happen, and that's what should be happening. Now, the obvious question then arises, if everybody knows that these guys up here know more about this than I do, but if all over this country millions of people sense the potential to transform our energy system, why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we doing it? Well, this I know a little bit about, because I sit in the United States Senate. So let me begin by telling you, nothing passes the United States Congress without the approval of the oil companies, corporate America, and Wall Street. And unless we address that issue, we're not going to address this issue. All of you know, 40, 50 years ago, the tobacco industry lied and lied and lied and killed millions of people, including my father. And they refused to tell the truth, and they were able to get away with spreading their poison. We know not so many years ago that the crooks on Wall Street destroyed this economy, resulting in millions of people losing their jobs, their homes, and their life savings. We know that today the food industry is wreaking havoc with the children of this country in terms of unhealthy processed food. Now, how does all of that happen? It happens because of the unbelievable greed and power of a small number of people in the billionaire class who could care less about this planet, our kids, or working people. And unbelievably, and all of you know we're in a very important campaign right now, and it is beyond belief that here we are saying that this is the planetary crisis of the time. You're hardly hearing any debate on global warming in this campaign. And if you are hearing debate, it's for those people who want the Keystone Pipeline and criticize those of us who oppose it. That's the debate. Furthermore, the reality is that you have folks like the Koch brothers who are spending hundreds of millions of dollars electing candidates from one end of the country to the other, who not only will go to war against working people, these candidates are not allowed to even acknowledge the reality of climate change. Now, we could have a debate, what is the best way forward? It's a good debate. But the time is long overdue for people not to be ignoring the reality. We have a major political party in Washington that refuses even to acknowledge the reality of climate change. So what do we do? The answer to this problem, the answer to the reason why we are the only nation on earth, major nation, not to have a national health care program, the reason why we have more wealth and income inequality in this country than any time since 1929, the reason that we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of any major country on earth, it all comes back to one reality. You got a small number of people with enormous economic and political power, and they want more and more and more. And the only way that I know that we stop them is when millions of people do exactly what we are going to be doing tomorrow. Take to the streets, take to the ballot boxes. We can beat them. Because at the end of the day, there are a lot more of us than there are of them. But unless every person in this room and millions more pledges to get heavily involved in this issue and in the political process in general, their money will win. They got the money, we got the people. Can we educate? Can we organize? Can we bring our people together to transform the energy system and make government work for all of us? That is the issue of the moment. Let's work together to make that happen. Thank you all very much.
Senator, before we go down the row and hear from the rest of the panelists, if I could ask you one follow-up question. With Congress, with the House of Representatives certainly to be Republican for at least the next 2 years, and you don't know about the Senate yet, is Congress completely out of the picture for years to come for doing anything about global warming? And if so, despite whatever bills that you and others who agree with you may introduce, does the policy action have to be elsewhere? And if so, where?
Well, clearly there are opportunities at the state level, but I believe very much that Congress will listen when millions of people demand that they listen. I really do believe that. So you're right in saying right now you got a Republican Congress owned by the big money interests. But I think if we continue to build on what we are seeing right here in New York City today, yes, we can make them an offer that they can't refuse. And that is they're not going to stay in Congress unless they start changing what they're doing.
Thank you. All right. The format for the rest of the evening, each panelist will speak for up to 10 minutes. Then I will moderate a conversation among them, including some questions from you. And please, when we get to that, no long speeches so we can give people a chance to participate in some numbers. So we will next hear from Bill McKibben.
Well, thank you very much. And what a pleasure to hear Bernie talking. You all were not paying quite close enough attention because you missed the most important applause line in his talk. He said, just in passing, I was in Iowa recently. That's an important line, and we don't want to lose him from Vermont. But if he had to move to Pennsylvania Avenue for a little while, we'd be okay. Look, the question about what comes next for climate justice is a really important one, and I have this strong feeling I'm the wrong person to be answering it tonight. For me, what comes next is at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, we need absolutely everybody out on Central Park West. We were hoping when we started this thing, hoping that we'd have the biggest climate rally there had ever been. That was about 80,000 people in Copenhagen in 2009. We were really hoping we'd have 100,000 people. It's clear now we're going to have twice that and maybe more. This is going to be not just the largest climate change gathering ever. It's also going to be the largest political gathering about anything in this country in a long time. And that's a good sign that people are waking up. It's an open question whether we've started in time. The science of climate change is dark and hard. And I'd be lying to you if I told you that we're going to sweep to victory. And look, what really comes next for climate justice is an awful lot of pain and suffering for an awful lot of people. We've already raised the temperature 1 degree Celsius. We're going to go to 2 degrees Celsius almost no matter what we do, it looks like. And on current trajectory, we're going to raise the temperature of the planet 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, 8 or 9 degrees Fahrenheit before this century is out. And if that happens, if we allow anything like that to happen, then we will have created not just the greatest crisis in human civilization, we may already be there, but the most profoundly unjust thing that has ever happened on this planet. The people who will suffer, are already suffering most and hardest, are those who did the least to cause this problem. The good news is that they are in this fight too. When we started 350.org, the reason that it has the kind of funny name that it has is not just because it's an important number, but because we wanted to organize all over the globe, and Arabic numerals cross the linguistic boundaries that words can't. 350 means the same thing everywhere, which I think is why we've been able to organize about 20,000 rallies over the years in every country except North Korea. This weekend, there are 2,900 solidarity marches going on in 170 some countries around the world. The first pictures are already flowing in, and they are incredibly beautiful. There are thousands of people on the march in Ankara, in Istanbul, in Bujumbura, in Burundi, in Delhi, in Hyderabad, and in the Nilgiri Hills, in Papua New Guinea. The list is, the Flickr account's already kind of overflowing with pictures, and they are incredibly beautiful to look at. Do not think for a moment that we're alone when we're out on 6th Avenue tomorrow. It's not just New York, it is all over the world, but New York is really important. It's fulfilling its role tomorrow as the most unusual and pivotal city in the world. Not only is it a great metropolitan area on its own, and the people who have organized this march are from that metropolitan area. It's not me, it's the environmental justice community in this city. People like Eddie Battista, Elizabeth Jean-Pierre, Thomas Garduno, on and on and on, who have done the organizing and come up with the plans and all of that. But New York, of course, is also our one global city. And so tomorrow we also get to speak some to the United Nations and to world leaders. It's not that we're going there appealing for anything. We're not. We're out there to demonstrate our frustration and our anger. We should not have to be marching. 25 years ago, the world scientists issued a perfectly clear warning about what was going on. In a rational world, that would be enough. But as Bernie described, we live in a world where decisions are made not on reason, but on power. And so our job is to figure out how to amass enough power to take on the money power that dominates our lives. The richest person in the world is the two Koch brothers combined, okay? And they stand for a fossil fuel industry that is the 1% of the 1%, the richest and most powerful enterprise that humans have ever known. And so to fight them, we have to take them on directly. Some of that will also happen on Monday morning at 9 o'clock, Naomi, people gathering down on Wall Street. Wear blue, okay? We're blue. The idea is to flood Wall Street, this time somewhat more benignly than Sandy flooded Wall Street, okay? People will be acting powerfully. They'll be acting powerfully in all sorts of other ways over the months ahead, because a big march is an important moment in a movement, but it's just one day. Movements go on, and they need to get bigger and spread out and do more. One of the things that's sort of unique about tomorrow is we're all coming together in one place. That's been unusual in this movement because, happily, in this era, we can do enormous amounts spread out around the country and around the world, but linked through our new technologies. That's why we've organized a lot of this the way we have. It's really the first kind of open source movement that we've yet had. So things that are happening include the ongoing blockades and defensive action against one bad project after another. You know, when we organized the protest, the civil disobedience against the Keystone Pipeline, and it turned into the largest civil disobedience action about 30 years in anything in this country. When we did that, our hope was that we'd slow down the Keystone Pipeline, and that's happened so far, and that's good, and thank you so much to all who are involved. But it's also had a kind of tonic effect on a lot of other things. I was really pleased when I saw someone sent me a copy of the Trade Journal it was like Pipeline World or something last year, and the head of one of the companies said, "We'll never be allowed to build a pipeline in peace again," you know, and that pleased me. Out in Seattle, they are mounting an incredibly spirited defense against coal ports on the West Coast and the coal trains that would feed them. In New York State, people are mounting an amazing defense against fracking. I'm sure that our astute political commentator, Mr. Lehrer, noted, as I'm sure Governor Cuomo might have too, that Zephyr Teachout carried every county where fracking is at issue in New York State in the Democratic primary last week. We need to reach the point where politicians begin to fear us as much as they fear oil money. And that would be a good thing. But it's not mostly or completely going to be decided by politicians. It's going to be decided by the kind of movement that we can build and by the transformation that can happen as we move this economy off the fuels that have allowed that kind of centralization of power and wealth in our society. The day when the world runs on 1 million or 100 million solar panels on 100 million rooftops is the day when we'll no longer have concentrations of power like those that allow the Koch brothers to reign in Washington, those that allow Chevron to give the biggest campaign contribution of all time. None of this will be easy or simple. I think I didn't come up with it, but I really like the slogan that people have been using for this march. And they say to change everything, it's going to take everyone. And it really kind of is. This is the biggest problem that humans have ever come up against. We're up against the biggest concentrations of wealth and power we've ever seen. So we got to get to work in a serious way. And I am just so grateful to people being here and being loud. We're not going to have speeches tomorrow when we march, which frankly I think is no enormous loss. And I'm glad not to have to give one. What we are going to do at one point is make some noise. So if you have something, if you play a trumpet, bring your trumpet. If you have an air horn, bring it, whatever it is. Because after we fall silent for a minute to remember the people who've already been the victims of climate change, then we're going to make a loud noise for a couple of minutes. We're going to sound as it were. I mean, you know, New York, everybody hates noise, and everybody hates when the car alarm goes off, and whatever. This isn't like that. This is the burglar alarm on the people who are trying to steal our future. Okay, and please remember that sound and that energy. It's the sound of some frustration and some anger. And then we're going to have to take that frustration and anger and mix it with the joy and hope that will come with rubbing shoulders with a couple of 100,000 other people, and then take it back whence we came and make change fast. The final thing I would say is that This is an unusual problem in that it's the first of its kind that we've ever come up against that's absolutely a time test, okay? If we don't get, the physics of global warming are such that if we don't get it right quickly, then we don't get it right. We don't, the urgency that I feel and that so many of you feel is rooted in the fact that we have to make this change now. And that requires us to, I guess the only way to say it is, it's both an obligation and a privilege to be around right now. The obligation and the privilege of getting to work on the greatest problem that there's ever been in a place with the most leverage on that problem. Thank you guys for rising to that challenge, and thank you so much for being here. We'll see you tomorrow morning on Central Park West. It's going to be a little chaotic and crazy. Just everybody stay calm, have fun. Look at the unbelievably beautiful art that hundreds, thousands of young people have been there in these warehouses over in Bushwick and places have been building for weeks. You're going to blow your mind at how pretty it is and how powerful it is. Well, thank you guys very much for being here.
Our next speaker is Naomi Klein.
Hey everybody, how you feeling? A little depressed? Who's depressed? All right, let me read you something that I hope will cheer you up. This is one of my favorite quotes in the book. It's from Mia Yoshitani, who is an incredible climate justice activist in the Bay Area in Oakland. She's the executive director of the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. And I love this quote because it just really summarizes, I think, the way forward. So, the climate justice fight here in the US and around the world is not just a fight against the biggest ecological crisis of all time. It is the fight for a new economy, a new energy system, a new democracy, a new relationship to the planet and to each other, for land, water, and food sovereignty, for indigenous rights, for human rights, and dignity for all. When climate justice wins, we win the world we want. We can't sit this one out, not because we have too much to lose, but because we have too much to gain. We are bound together in this battle, not just for a reduction in the parts per million of CO2, but to transform our economies and rebuild a world that we want today. So why haven't we done it? As Bill said, we have known about this problem for a long time. Scientists have known about it for a long time, but the year when we lost all plausible deniability was 1988. That was the year that James Hansen, in June, testified on Capitol Hill that he now had a high degree of certainty that there was a connection. He eventually said it with a 99% degree of certainty that there was a connection between greenhouse gas emissions and warming. Now, he happened to be speaking on a day that broke all heat records in Washington, D.C. It hasn't been broken since. Most records have, but that one still stands. And the air conditioning system in the building that he was speaking in was so overloaded that it broke. So sweat was pouring down everyone's faces as he was talking, underlining the point. And this was a point when 87% of Americans knew about global warming. That year, in 1988, the editors of Time magazine sat down to choose their Man of the Year. They were still calling it a Man of the Year, and they decided to choose our endangered planet Earth and put planet Earth on the cover. And that felt to a lot of people in the environmental movement like a real turning point. It really felt that there was a consciousness shifting. And in fact, I quote at length from the article that went with that cover story, because it was quite remarkable in the diagnosis. It didn't just talk about carbon, it talked about a worldview, that we have a worldview that is really at the heart of this environmental crisis that has to do with dominance, dominating each other and dominating the Earth, a mechanistic view of the Earth, and it was this that needed to change. This was Time magazine, 1988. All right, what else was happening in 1988? Now, the argument I'm making is that the reason we have failed is because this crisis suffers from an epic case of historical bad timing, because just as that consciousness was struggling to emerge, to shift, there was another project afoot. 1988 was the year that Canada and the US signed a historic free trade agreement that was eventually extended into the North American Free Trade Agreement, into NAFTA, which eventually was extended into the creation of the World Trade Organization a few years later. A year after Hansen testified, the Berlin Wall collapsed. It was right around this time that Francis Fukuyama declared history over. This was the height of, this was the most triumphant moment for an ideological project which in most parts of the world is known as neoliberalism. Joseph Stiglitz calls it market fundamentalism. Here it's just the air you breathe, filled as it is with pollution. And this is the ideological project that says, as Margaret Thatcher did, that there's no such thing as society, that we are nothing more than our most selfish desires, that by expressing those desires we do the most good, that the biggest problems happen when people try to do good with other people's money, as Milton Friedman said. So this was the triumphant moment for that ideology. And at the very moment when our governments were earnestly gathering at UN summits to tackle the climate crisis, well, more powerful wings of those same governments were gathering at trade summits, at WTO summits, to lock in the rules of this ideological campaign. Privatization, deregulation, austerity, free trade, we know it, we live it, this is our time, it has been our time for the past 3.5 decades or more in other parts of the world. So this ideology is directly at odds with what we need to do to respond to this crisis. That's the problem, okay? And it has been since the beginning. And we can see this very, very clearly now, although it should have been clear from the beginning. I was going to time myself, oops. I'll give you an example. I live in Toronto, Ontario, and my government adopted a pretty good green energy plan. In fact, it was lauded as the best, most ambitious emission reduction plan in all of North America by Al Gore. It set some really ambitious targets. But it wasn't just about reducing emissions. It was also about creating jobs. It was launched in the midst of the banking crisis. It was launched in 2009. My province was hit really, really hard by the collapse of the big three automakers because that's a big part of our economy. And so when this plan was launched, in order to get it through and sell it to the public, it contained a provision that required that anybody who wanted to take advantage of the various incentives in the green energy program had to produce a certain percentage of the goods locally in Ontario. Not all, but say if you're making solar panels or wind turbines, you've got to make 40 to 60% of them in the province of Ontario. Well, it was a fantastic success. 31,000 manufacturing jobs were created. I tell the story of this solar plant in the suburbs of Toronto that was sort of a poster child for this transition because it had been an auto parts plant and it closed down in the midst of the economic crisis, and it was sitting empty, but it was transformed into a plant making solar panels. a whole bunch of workers who had worked for Chrysler and had worked for the auto giant Magna got jobs working in the plant making solar panels. So it was just like this good news story, old economy, new economy, yay. Well, what happened next is Japan and the European Union took Canada to the World Trade Organization and said that this provision that people who wanted to take advantage of the green energy, of the feed-in tariff, had to produce locally, violated Canada's obligations under the World Trade Organization. And this is just one example. The US has challenged China's policies, India's policies for exactly the same thing, for providing supports for local industry. And then, of course, the US goes to climate negotiations and points the finger at China and India and says, you aren't doing enough, and they point the finger. And so it's ridiculous, because at this very moment when if we're going to hit the emission reduction targets we need to hit, every government in the world needs to be doing whatever it takes to roll out the most ambitious plans they can and do what it takes to sell it locally. And our governments are running to the World Trade Organization and trying to knock down each other's windmills. That's just one example. A scarier example is that the province of Quebec is one of the parts of the world that won a moratorium against fracking. The people won that. The movements won that. Now, a company registered in the U.S. is challenging under NAFTA that decision, saying that it violates their right to drill under the St. Lawrence River. TransCanada is making noises that if the U.S., if Obama does say no to the Keystone XL pipeline, maybe they'll challenge it in trade court. Do we even have the right? So that's just one example. Okay, free trade. More examples of that clash. Privatization, right? What's another thing we did in this era that we were supposed to be fighting climate change is we auctioned off our electricity, our energy, our water systems, our transportation systems to private players who are driven by profit alone. That's not a really great thing to do if you need to roll out the kind of ambitious programs that we need to be doing right now. And we hear a lot about Germany as an example of a country, a highly industrialized country, that is doing what we all need to be doing, which is shifting to renewable energy and doing it fast. In a decade and a half, Germany has gone from having a very low percentage of its electricity grid coming from renewables to having 25% of its electricity coming from renewable energy, mostly wind and solar, much of it decentralized and small scale. Like there's 900 energy cooperatives providing energy and feeding into the grid. Much of it is a small scale utilities. And 25%, the equivalent number for the United States is 4%, okay? So this is really, really impressive, and it's happening fast. What we often don't hear is that one of the reasons why this is happening is that in hundreds of cities and towns in Germany, small towns and also big cities like Hamburg, citizens have voted, or their governments have simply decided to take back control over their electricity grids from the private companies that privatized them in the 1990s. Okay, wrap when you can. All right, I'm going to wrap when I can. I'm going to tell you guys something. There's somebody here tonight. Okay, just one more thing. Austerity. How are we supposed to respond to a crisis that requires that we invest massively in the public sphere when all we hear is that we have to cut back, when we need to invest massively in public transit? So we know what to do, but we are locked within an ideological system that tells us that we can't. I'll tell you who understands this: the climate change deniers at the Heartland Institute. People like Mark Morano, who I'm told is here tonight. They understand that if the science is true, if the science is right, then of course we need to break every rule in their idiotic playbook, because it is at war with life on Earth.
Our next speaker is Chris Hedges.
Thank you. It's, of course, an honor to be here, especially with Bill, who, was it 25 years ago, End of Nature?
Yes, this month.
Yeah. For 25 years, has been fighting often a very lonely and courageous fight for a sane planet. And we owe him, more than I think any of us can express. I want to talk a little bit about power and why I think this march, which is incredibly important, has to be seen as the prelude to resistance. We've undergone a transformation during the past few decades, what John Ralston Saul calls a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. We are no longer a capitalist democracy endowed with a functioning liberal class. And this liberal class once made piecemeal and incremental reform possible. Liberals in the old Democratic Party, such as Birch Bayh, George McGovern, who worked with Ralph Nader, and I urge you all to go back and look at Ralph Nader's speech on the first Earth Day on YouTube, to pass things like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Mine, Health and Safety Act, the Freedom of Information Act, OSHA, who made common cause with labor unions to protect workers, who stood up to the arms industry and a bloated military, no longer exist within the Democratic Party, as Nader has been lamenting for several years. They were pushed out by corporate donors that began to transform the political landscape with the election of Ronald Reagan. And this is why Democrats, as Bill Curry points out, have not enacted any major social or economic reforms since the historic environmental laws of the early 1970s. We are governed rather by a species of corporate totalitarianism, what Sheldon Wolin calls inverted totalitarianism, and by that he means a systems of corporate power that purports to pay fealty to electoral politics, the Constitution, the iconography and language of American patriotism, and yet internally has seized all of the levers of power to render the citizen impotent. The old liberal class, which functioned as a safety valve and addressed grievances and injustices in times of economic and political distress, has been destroyed. And self-identified liberals, including Barack Obama, who continue to speak in the old language of liberalism, in fact serve corporate power. And this has been true since... This has been true since the Clinton administration, when Clinton found that by doing corporate bidding he could get corporate money, thus NAFTA, the destruction of the welfare system, the explosion of mass incarceration, deregulation of the FCC, the destruction of the 1933 Glass-Steagall reform, which protected our banking system from speculators. And in essence, Clinton turned the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, which was kind of diabolically brilliant because it forced the Republican Party to shift so far to the right, it became insane. But by the time Clinton was finished, the rhetoric of self-professed liberals in the political establishment was nothing more than a public relations game. And that is why there has been complete continuity from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. Obama's election has done nothing to halt the expanding assault on civil liberties. In fact, Obama's assault has been worse. It's done nothing to halt the Bush bailouts of the big banks, the endless imperial wars, the failure to regulate Wall Street, the hiring of corporate lobbyists to write legislation and serve in the government, and of course the expansion of drilling and fracking, and of course we don't want to forget the security and surveillance state. I don't need to address, I think many people have, and you are all well aware of the Democratic Party's squalid record on the environment. And I would refer you all to look at Charlie Cray and Peter Montague's Greenpeace report, The Kingpins of Carbon and Their War on Democracy, where they lay it out. Obama, in return for financial support from the Kingpins of Carbon, has in fact cynically undermined international climate treaties. We know this because of the leaks by Snowden and WikiLeaks. It's used the intelligence agencies to spy on those carrying out climate negotiations, to thwart caps on carbon emissions, and push through useless, non-binding agreements. It has overseen a massive expansion of fracking. It's pushed through a series of disastrous trade agreements, such as the TPP and the TAFTA, that will increase fracking along with expanding our exports of coal, oil, and gas. And of course, it's authorized the excavation of tar sands in Utah and Alabama, approved the southern half of the Keystone Pipeline. They've figured ways to get the tar sands oil now down through old pipelines, although they're not built for it, so they may not even need the northern leg. And if it's permitted seismic testing for offshore drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, the East Coast, and Alaska, hundreds of sea mammals die under seismic testing, including, of course, the Florida coast, defying a campaign promised. The appeal, I think, to these self-identified liberals within the establishment who have no capacity or desire to carry out radical reforms means we're pouring energy into a black hole. And this is what the corporate state seeks. The Democratic Party, unlike the Republican Party, does speak to us rationally. The party says it seeks to protect civil liberties, regulate Wall Street, is concerned about the plight of the working class, but in all of these areas, like the Republican Party, it has sold out the citizenry for corporate power. To assume that Obama or the Democratic Party, simply because they acknowledge the reality of climate change, while the lunatic fringe of the Republican Party does not, is better equipped to deal with the crisis is incorrect. Republicans appeal to one constituency, the Democrats appeal to another, but both parties have and will do nothing to halt the ravaging of the planet. If Sheldon Wolin is right, and I believe he is, then when we begin to build our mass movements, and we have to look at tomorrow's march again as a prelude to acts of civil disobedience, these acts, and I think everybody on the panel supports them, including the Flood Wall Street event that I know Naomi and I will be at on Monday morning. We have to understand that the corporate state, including the Democratic elite, will react the way all calcified states react. They will use the security and surveillance apparatus. They will use military, police forces, and under Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, the military itself, to violently shut down dissent by force. We saw it in Occupy. The legal and organizational mechanisms that are now in place to, with a flip of a switch, put this nation instantly under martial law. And when acts of mass civil disobedience begin on Monday, including with Flood Wall Street and later Occupy the UN, I am almost certain the face of the corporate state, as it did during the Occupy movement, will reveal itself. If the response of the corporate state is repression rather than reform, then our strategy and our tactics must be different. We will have to cease appealing to the system. We will have to view the state, including the Democratic establishment, as antagonistic to genuine reform, and we will have to speak in the language of overthrow and revolution. We will have to carry out acts of civil disobedience that seek to cripple the mechanisms of corporate power. And the corporate elites, blinded by their lust for profit and foolish enough to believe that they can protect themselves from climate change, will not veer from the path of ecocide unless they are forced from power. And this means the beginning of a titanic clash between our corporate masters and ourselves. Thank you.
And please welcome once again our final speaker, Kshama Sawant.
If you don't mind, I'm going to stand. Whenever I'm thinking about politics, I feel really passionate and it's hard for me to sit down. It's an honor and a privilege to be here for this incredible weekend, and it's been an honor to listen to my esteemed fellow panelists. Please accept my heartfelt thanks and congratulations to the thousands who have worked so hard to organize for this weekend. Sisters and brothers, history is calling on us, and to answer that call, we must make sure tomorrow's protest marks a turning point, a decisive turn towards collective action, demanding the fundamental structural changes that are necessary to address climate change. Tomorrow's protests will bring tens of thousands together, environmental activists, students, workers, and their unions. We are building on thousands who have heroically been fighting the Keystone XL pipeline. In Seattle, other activists and I have been involved in civil disobedience against oil and coal trains. This growing threat of climate disaster on wheels. But whether on rail or through pipelines, big oil is hell-bent on trafficking its profits. They have the leadership of both political parties in their back pockets. It will be no small matter to stop them. Our message on Sunday needs to be clear. If you are not yet organized, there is an urgent need to get involved and stay engaged. Join an environmental group, join a labor union, join the socialists, become a part of this struggle. Our demands to the so-called world leaders also need to be clear. We need massive public projects to put an end to fossil fuel as part of a rapid transformation to clean energy, along with a dramatic expansion of mass transit, all of which would create millions of living wage unionized jobs. The people controlling these climate summits are utterly beholden to the fossil fuel industry and the financial aristocracy that dominates the world economy. The richest 5 corporations in the world are all fossil fuel companies. These corporations have all the resources, all the technology necessary to end the fossil fuel economy and power our global society on clean energy. So why haven't they done it? And as Naomi was saying, the truth is that no amount of scientific evidence, no voice of reason will talk them out of drilling every last barrel of oil out of the ground. Take ExxonMobil, for example, which spends millions promoting its green credentials, yet in a recent letter, they assured their shareholders they will sell all of the oil and gas they have found and all that they will find in the foreseeable future. This is the reality of international capitalism. This is the product of the gigantic casino of speculation created by those highway robbers on Wall Street and the rapacious oil vultures. In this system, the market is God and everything is sacrificed on the altar of profit. We must face up to the fact that the so-called free market will not be able to end its addiction to fossil fuels and certainly not at the speed that is required. Nor is it capable of the kind of coordinated, democratic, international planning that will be necessary. A lot of people are prepared to change their personal lifestyles, and that is important. However, I'm focusing here on the big corporations. And why? It is estimated that almost 2/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions since the dawning of the industrial age came from 90 corporations. Only 90 companies, Exxon, Shell, BP, Chevron, you know their names. To address the climate crisis, we must be able to democratically and rationally decide how these resources, which are currently concentrated in the hands of a small cabal of oligarchs and speculators, can be directed, so that society as a whole can use these resources in the interests of people and the planet. But how else can this be done except by bringing the giant energy corporations into public ownership? Because it is straightforward. You cannot control what you do not own. And in the course of our struggle, we will of course need to deploy many different strategies and tactics depending on the concrete circumstances. But one thing should be crystal clear. We cannot be bound by what is acceptable to establishment politicians and the big corporations they serve. Our movement must be guided instead by the needs of working people and the environment. There are experiences from other social movements. Recently in Seattle, my organization, Socialist Alternative, helped put forward a demand for a $15 an hour minimum wage for all workers. Some at first dismissed this as unrealistic, but it was a demand that corresponded to the real needs of working people. We worked with others to mobilize a strong grassroots movement to win it. Corporations were always against it, but they had to concede in the face of growing mass support. It is true we did not win everything, and the political servants of big business, by the way, all Democrats in Seattle, carved out loopholes. But we won the highest minimum wage in the country by demanding it. Far more than we would have won if we had started out only asking for what we were told was acceptable to big business. In fighting climate change, we need the same approach, boldly demanding a massive program of public investment in renewable energy and mass transit. Let's link this with a fundamental challenge to the broken system of capitalism. This is the way to win the most, starting here and now, while at the same time offering the vision of a lasting solution. A vision of a just and sustainable society, a socialist world that can deliver a sustainable and high standard of living for all. I think there is broad agreement in this room on the need for collective action and struggle, and the need to get organized independently of big business. In my opinion, however, this will not be achievable unless we also confront the reality that is corporate politics. Nobody here would disagree that we cannot rely on the right-wing climate change denying Republicans, but neither can we rely as Chris has said, on the big business Democrats. Under Obama, there has been a massive expansion, not of clean energy, but of fossil fuels, of oil drilling in the Arctic, of fracking. It is an expansion that hasn't been seen in more than a generation. And it's not just Obama. The Democratic Party establishment is awash with oil money. If we tone down our demands to appease the Democratic Party elite, they will simply use our generosity to further appease their corporate donors. Only an independent force of the 99%, a new party based on workers, young people, environmentalists, and labor will be able to fight Wall Street and big business. A party that will struggle and boldly advocate for alternatives to this crisis-ridden system. It was great to hear Bernie Sanders tonight. There has been some talk about Bernie running for president in 2016. To provide an alternative to Hillary Clinton. I don't always agree with Bernie, I'll be honest, especially his recent positions on US foreign policy, but just for a moment, let us imagine the impact of a well-known and credible independent left challenger of the stature of Bernie running as a challenge to the two parties of big business in the 2016 elections. If we had a left-wing campaign that refused any corporate cash and called for taxing corporations and the super wealthy to fund a massive green jobs program, an end to corporate welfare, a $15 minimum wage, single-payer health care, and a cancellation of student debt. I would appeal to Bernie to run as an independent candidate for president in 2016, not tied to the Democrats and their big business agenda. The ecological clock is ticking too fast for us to let the 2016 political arena be dominated by climate change denying Republicans and pro-fracking Democrats. We need a voice for environmental sanity, an alternative to this dysfunctional two-party system. An independent left campaign would appeal to the millions of Americans who are disgusted with the shameless pandering to Wall Street that is carried out in the name of political realism. In fact, a recent poll showed that 60% of Americans want a third party. It can act, such a campaign can act as a lightning rod for hundreds of thousands of workers and young people who want to fight back, laying the basis for a movement that can win real gains regardless of who happens to occupy the White House in 2017. I'm going to end here. The great working class fighter Rosa Luxemburg said a century ago that the future will either be one of socialism or barbarism. It is up to us to ensure that our future is not one of the disasters of climate change and capitalism, but instead one of cooperation, humanity, beauty, and sustainability. Thank you.
I want to thank all our speakers, and I guess I would be remiss in my duty as a journalist if I didn't follow that by asking Senator Sanders, do you have any plans to return to Iowa, or is there anything you would like to rule out tonight?
Iowa in 2 weeks. Here's the issue, as I see it. We are living in extraordinarily dangerous times, as I think you've heard from all of our speakers, in terms of a collapsing middle class of massive income and wealth inequality. And when we talk about third-party politics, and I apologize for not being as familiar as I should with Seattle, and I know you're doing great work there. But actually, in Vermont, we have been leaders in that direction, as I think you know. We have 10% of our state senate is Progressive Party, and I suspect by the time this election is over, 8 or 10 members of the Vermont House of Representatives will be third party. And they're doing a great job. They're doing a great job. And right now, for a variety of reasons, we have a very strong Vermont Workers Center. It is possible, and it's going to be very difficult, and I don't want to promise more than may happen, but it is possible that the small state of Vermont, the very small state of Vermont, may lead this nation forward into a single-payer Medicare for all system. And as the former mayor of Burlington during the 1980s, we put together a coalition. It wasn't a formal party under Vermont law, but it was a coalition. Everybody knew what it was, which took on the Democrats and Republicans. And we did pretty well. But the issue is, it's a very simple issue, and I don't know the answer. The issue is, given the nature of where we are today as a nation, can we in fact put together an effective grassroots third-party movement in America? And it's and the answer is maybe. And the answer is maybe not. Chris talked about somebody I've known for many years, Ralph Nader. And I remember Ralph. Ralph is an old friend, brilliant guy who has done enormous things for this country. But I remember during his campaign, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, Ralph got up and said there's no difference between the Democrats and the Republicans. We need a new party. Didn't happen. Point being, only point that I'm making here, and I, agree with virtually everything Kshama said. The question that we have to ask is where we are at this moment, and I frankly don't know the answer. There are states in America right now you can't get on the ballot as a third-party candidate because the deck is so stacked by the two-party system. All right? So first of all, I want to thank everybody for some of your very kind remarks and support. It is a difficult decision. Number one, if I run, I want to run an effective and strong campaign. I don't want to run just an educational campaign, because if you run an educational campaign and you get 2% of the vote, in my view, we end up being all of the ideas that we are talking about, which I think reflects where millions of people are in. We look bad. It's a step backward. So one of the issues that I have got to make is there support around this country for people to stand up and get involved in the political process in a way that we have not seen in modern American history? And that is, to be very honest with you, exactly what I am exploring right now. So thank you.
Bill McKibben, if I might, we've heard on this panel tonight some pretty strong language, and I wonder what you, as the main voice or a main voice of the climate march, want the front page of the papers and their Twitter feeds and et cetera to be saying on Monday morning. We heard from Chris that This is a prelude to civil disobedience and overthrow and revolution. Kshama just asked people to join the Socialist Party and for public ownership of private corporations. We heard Hillary Clinton booed in this hall by more than a few people. What is the unified message that you want people to take away?
You know, the people who are organizing the march, mostly, as I say, environmental justice community groups in New York, decided that there would be 8 spokespeople that would meet the press tomorrow morning. And they are people from around New York, from communities that have had to deal with things like Sandy, or that have to deal with the ongoing fact of, you know, living in places where every third kid has an asthma inhaler or whatever it is because of the fossil fuel industry. And my guess is that they'll do a good job of speaking powerfully in language, probably not ideological language, that a lot of people will hear and understand. And I think that they'll talk about the kind of ongoing campaigns that there are underway. Nobody thinks that marching for a day is going to change the world by itself. That's not how it works. But it takes a lot of people getting down and going after it, taking on. I think it's a good thing that everyone's trying to take on the richest companies on earth. I look over and see Rebecca Solnit over there, who's done such a good job working, along with all her writing, working on divestment in San Francisco and pushing them hard and making great progress. I look over in the other direction and see that great Vermont journalist David Goodman, who got a heck of a scoop on Thursday when Vermont Governor Peter Shumlin, I think maybe his sister has been coaching him on, but he got Vermont Governor Peter Shumlin to say he thought divestment was a good idea, the first governor in the country to do so. I think those are the kind of fights that are already. I mean, I don't know what other people are going to be able to organize. I know, all I know, because I've been doing it for 8 years, is that organizing stuff is hard. And we'll keep trying to, we organize. I think civil disobedience sometimes is a really good idea. I mean, I think we organized the biggest civil disobedience action in 30 years about anything, and the biggest protests against President Obama that have happened yet, over this Keystone Pipeline. So I think it's a good idea. I think it's a better idea to do things than to talk about them sometimes. And, that's just sort of my sense.
Let me ask you two how you would define success, other than by the numbers of the people who attend the march and make all that noise tomorrow after the moment of silence. Would it be potentially harmed by any kinds of shows of civil disobedience and massive arrests and the confrontations that you were predicting that could take place on Monday as a follow-up? Chris?
Well, I think the power of gathering in a march such as tomorrow is that it has the capacity to radicalize people, to make them ask questions about systems of power that maybe they hadn't asked before. And through that experience of gathering with large numbers of people to raise their voice, giving them a sense of empowerment in the face of corporate power, which has largely disempowered all of us. How how do we define success? I think many people have criticized the Occupy movement for not having demands. I disagree. I think the Occupy had a very clear demand, and that is we want the corporate coup that took place to be reversed. Because every problem we have in this country, from the destruction of our civil liberties to this disastrous Obamacare, which is a big corporate giveaway, to the chronic unemployment, it all stems from unregulated, unchecked corporate power, which, as Karl Marx correctly observed, is a revolutionary force. And there are no impediments now left within the system to stop it unless we destroy it. And I think that will come through sustained, massive acts of civil disobedience that discredit the system. What Václav Havel in his great 1978 essay called Living in Truth. And it's time for us to live in truth. And if we are willing to live in truth, we can expose the bankruptcy of the oligarchic corporate elite that has us in a death grip.
Naomi, how will you define success?
How would I define success? Look, I don't think about marches in that way, success, failure, I really feel that this has already been such a tremendous success. I mean, the city just feels occupied by people's passion for this issue. And these debates are happening everywhere, and they're including people who, as recently as a year ago, were not talking about climate change at all. Now they're the most radical climate activists in the room. But I'll tell you, when Occupy Wall Street was launched, 3 years ago, and that was incredible, and I 100% supported it. But one thing that bothered me is that when the original manifesto was written, and all of the things wrong with capitalism were listed, climate change wasn't on the list. It didn't make the list. And I think that the fact that our economic model is driving us towards what our most conservative institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and the International Energy Agency are describing as a collapse of civilization is a pretty good argument against that system. And I think it's really exciting that so many people are taking it up. And what excites me most is the way in which this gives us the potential to build a movement of movements, okay? We're talking about our home. It touches absolutely everyone. And I frankly I think we should take a little step back from I feel like there is a little bit of sectarianism creeping in, and it's just, about taking the hardest line. And what I think is more exciting than that is looking at who in this country is already organized. Who is already organized? Who is already bringing people to the streets? Because I guarantee you that every single one of those issues is touched by climate. And I think our great if we think about the timeline that we are at, we are in what some people started calling a few years back decade zero, okay? I mean, we need to turn things around by the end of this decade. That ecological clock is ticking, as Kshama said. We have no time to waste. And if we think realistically, are we going to build this movement of millions in that short time? No. But do we have the potential to weave together all of our existing movements and supercharge them with existential urgency? Bill and I are writers. I believe in deadlines, And without deadlines,
your editor certainly
nothing happens. And so you know, the issue of money in politics, which has come up over and over again, that touches absolutely everybody who is trying to get anything progressive done in this country. So the potential for us to build these broad coalitions is enormous, and to have climate change simply be a layer on top, or a layer that adds that urgency, that weaves it together because it affects us all. That's what I find exciting, and I think we've lost so many opportunities. You know, the streets of Rio were convulsing in riots ahead of the World Cup because people were demanding free public transit instead of expensive instead of expensive stadiums. And yet, I don't think there was a single large green group in the world that said, you are climate activists, even if you never use the word climate, right? And these are the sorts of bridges that we need to be building, because we know it takes massive public investment. But this is starting to happen. And one of the most exciting things about tomorrow's march, and why it's already a success, is that there's huge representation from organized labor. This is a big, big, big breakthrough, you know? So you know, I mean, setting the electoral politics aside, and I do think a lot of what was said tonight was really exciting, and I do think that articulating that positive vision is the only thing that is going to help people get over the fear I mean, I think the thing about climate change, is that so many of us, the reason so many of us took so long to engage with this issue, is that it's just terrifying. You know, once you really look at the science, we're dealing with that existential terror. And the mistake I think that the environmental movement made for many years was thinking that you could mobilize people just with fear. No, it's the combination of that fear that makes us leap, and having somewhere to leap to. And what is exciting, I think, is that we're starting to see the emergence of a real agenda, of a real political agenda that weaves together these movements. So to the extent to which the march it sketches out some of those early connections, the connections between climate and immigration, for instance. I mean, this is such a strong connection because, of course, climate is forcing more and more people to leave their homes. And this is part of a climate justice agenda. Getting money out of politics, good jobs, all of it. The connections are endless. So we need to weave together this movement from all of our movements, and then we need to get even bigger than that.
But you are saying... You are saying that even if the climate issue didn't exist, to go back to my Google search, if ocean algae or liquid metal batteries or 3D printers, or if we could regulate our way out of climate change with a really strong carbon tax or something very focused on carbon and climate were to be effective, you would be calling for the same things, right?
Yeah.
The same larger institutional
and I always
structural
have.
Change.
I always have, but none of those things can do it. And we've wasted a huge amount of time pretending that this crisis is compatible with tiny little fiddles around the system. And this is why I make the argument, it's a controversial argument, that the climate change deniers understand the threat better than some of the liberal green groups.
So a carbon tax could anything that the climate...
A carbon tax cannot get us to 8 to 10% emission reductions a year. It just simply can't.
And the climate summit that this is time to proceed, coming up with world leaders later in the week in New York, is there anything they could do that's climate focused specifically to solve the problem?
Is there anything that they could do in New York this week?
At the climate summit or at the level of global treaties, let's say?
I think eventually, with a sea change from a push from below, there is absolutely the potential for an international treaty to be binding, to have polluter pays principles in it. Nothing like that is on the table. So, I mean, it would be silly to be demanding something of that meeting in New York that isn't remotely part of the discussion. But is it conceivable that governments could get together and that there could be a treaty that would have binding emission reductions and penalties and that would force polluters to pay? Absolutely, it's possible. And absolutely, I mean, we will not solve this in an ad hoc way without regulation at every level, in our cities, in our states, provinces, countries, and international treaties.
And by the way, we have breaking news, as it turns out, and right in the middle of the panel, the Times reported that the de Blasio administration has vowed to cut greenhouse gas emissions in its buildings, that's public New York City buildings, by 80%, although that is by 2050. But they released, apparently they released that in the middle of the panel tonight.
A hard crowd.
All right, since we started a little bit late, we can go a little bit over our 10 o'clock listed end time, which is now, and take a few questions from the audience. Who has a question? Raise your hand. Okay, sir, right over there, and I ask you to keep it brief, and please ask a question.
I don't understand why the main argument against climate change is it's too expensive to save the planet.
Is that it's too expensive to save the planet? Why is the main argument against climate change that it's too expensive to save the planet? Do you understand the question?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the truths is it's really not that expensive to deal with this in any realistic way. There was a study that came out this week, and you can chaired by a former Mexican president from economists all over the world, said if we took the money that we're going to spend on fossil fuel infrastructure over the next 30 years and diverted it instead to working on climate solutions, the net cost of getting where we need to go would be roughly zero. And if you think about it, it makes sort of obvious sense. The good thing about solar power and wind power, aside from the fact that it saves the planet from getting destroyed, the other good thing about it is no one's yet figured out a way to meter the sun or the wind. So once you've got the things built, your fuel bill drops precipitously. That's a good thing. And it allows the problem is not that it's expensive so much for society. It'll take some upfront money, but everything takes some upfront money, and we're used to figuring out how to do upfront spending. The problem is not that it's ruinously expensive for them. It's ruinously expensive if you happen to own a coal mine or an oil well, okay? And in our system, if you happen to own a coal mine or oil well, then you have the money to go pervert the political system. And Bernie said it correctly at the beginning. They have all the money, so we better find some other currency to work in. The only ones we've got are the currencies of movements. That's what'll be on display tomorrow, and it'll be beautiful. It'll be on display Monday down on Wall Street. But that's how to think of this stuff. That's how we match these guys.
Let me just jump in if I may. I hear that. I'm on the Energy Committee. I'm on the Environmental Committee. I hear that all of the time. And the answer is it expensive? Yeah, it's reasonably expensive. Compared to what? Right. Compared to the destruction of the planet and a cost of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars rebuilding from the damage caused by extreme weather, drought, floods. Compared to that, it is not very expensive.
Kshama, briefly.
Just to quickly add to already the answers that have been given, which are really great, is that the question we should ask is expensive for whom, as Bill was suggesting. For the few hundred people who are unimaginably wealthy, the multi-billionaires whose wealth resides in those oil wells and the coal mines and the mountaintop removal and fracking, their wealth is tied in that. They have no incentive to move towards renewable energy. So they do see it as expensive. But for society, it's not, but it's a political question. How will you ensure that it happens if that wealth is not in your hands? And that is why we need to talk about public ownership of these resources.
Sir?
Thank you. This question is for Senator Sanders. I spent the week in Washington listening to the hearings with Hagel and Secretary Kerry about us going into war again with ISIS. You voted in favor of it, and 23 senators did not vote in favor of funding Syrian Free Army on Senate Bill 124 on Thursday. You voted against the bill to go to war. Could you explain to me why Congress is not voting for a new resolution? Because war is tied to climate change.
Do is just clear the record. I was on the floor for 15 minutes. Now, I strongly voted against that resolution.
Why don't we have Congress and senators going up and asking for a new resolution, not going into recess? This is an issue of war, and war is tied into climate change.
All right, thank you very much.
There was a vote. I think it was 77 members of the Senate voted yes, 22 or 3 of us voted no. It's going to come back on December 11th. This was part of what they call a continuing resolution. And my thought and my strong belief is that A, ISIS is a serious threat, but B, you don't deal with these things by having the United States alone being, taking on the Muslim world. I am outraged that you have a multi-billionaire family in Saudi Arabia with the 4th largest defense budget in the world. And you know what they're doing on this? Not much at all. We need an international coalition to address this issue. It cannot be American troops and American taxpayers alone.
Let's get a couple more, and then we will have to wrap it up. Ma'am?
Thank you. So the military is actually the largest polluter in the world and the biggest user of fossil fuels. So is the climate movement willing to take that on, as well as the trade agreements that have been mentioned that the President Obama has been negotiating? TPP and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. These are 2 trade agreements that are going to undermine all the work that we've done for decades to push for protection of the environment, protection of worker rights. Is the climate movement going to work with us in November when the Congress comes back and they introduce a fast-track bill to stop that? Because we've got to, if you're talking about this movement of movements, it's more than trying to push for solar energy. It's stopping these things that are setting us backwards. And so I would like to hear the climate movement talking about the U.S. being the largest empire in the world, the biggest user of fossil fuels, that military, and the trade agreements that are currently being negotiated.
Thank you. Last question.
I look around me and I don't see many people of color, which is a great sadness to me. And on the train, and I know there's some brothers and sisters here, I know that. But when we came across the train all the way from Oakland, California, and we had a large representation, there's a lot of us here, and we had a large representation of young people, people of color, indigenous people, and it was one of the most cathartic experiences of my life. Climate change is an equal opportunity disaster. It does not, even though it hit the people in Katrina more than it hit people, but today, and where I live in the mountains of California, we're having a disaster. 3 years of drought, the forest is burning out, and it's equal opportunity, it affects us all. So the question I have to any of you that want to address it is, we need to bring in our brothers and sisters of color to understand, and I understand their reason for fearing us for good reason, but we need to find a way to bring our brothers and sisters in.
Who wants it? Any of you want to?
You will, just to say, you will enjoy the march tomorrow, and you might want to go too and look at the pictures flowing in from around the world today. Most of the people working on climate change around the world are poor and black and brown and Asian and young, because that's what most of the world is made up of. And that's who's leading this fight all over the place.
Please thank our panelists. Please thank yourselves for coming tonight.